Hello, friends. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible, or maybe welcome back. I'm really delighted to be joined by a distinguished professor at Yale University, Professor Travis Zadeh. Hi, Travis. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Gabriel. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm a huge fan of your work. We're going to speak principally about this book, the Vernacular Qur'an. You've done a lot since then. This is I think, a 2012 book. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
some years ago. Yeah.
There's so many important contributions in the book about the question of the translation of the Quran, which we'll be speaking about, but also some of the theology behind the translation of the Quran, some of the controversies. So we'll get into all of that. I'll start with a brief bio, and then we'll get right to the question of whether the Quran can be translated. Why were there debates around this question? Why are there so many misconceptions today? So, friends, Travis Zadeh is professor of religious studies at Yale University. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard in comparative literature. He's the author of the aforementioned book, The Vernacular Qur'an, which has a subtitle, Translation and the Rise of Persian Exegesis. And more recently, Wonders and Rarities, the marvelous book that traveled the world and mapped the cosmos. And that was just 2023, so last year. The description is an account of wonder, nature, and empire by tracking the many afterlives of an Arabic compendium of natural history written in the wake of the Mongol conquest. So that's exciting. This new book. Hopefully, we'll get by the end of the episode to learn a little bit more about that. But if it's okay, Travis, I'd like to turn right to the question of the translation of the Quran. Is that okay? Was the
Yeah.
bio okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. Let's jump right
Okay.
in. Wonderful.
Okay. Super. So yeah, in the Vernacular Quran at the beginning, you tell the story of hearing a teaching on Al-Fatiha, Quran 1 in Istanbul. So you have this personal anecdote. Was it that moment when presumably the teaching was involved Turkish because you were in
Yeah,
Istanbul?
that's right.
Was it at that moment where you began to think about the translation of the Quran and all that it implies?
So I was in Istanbul at that point doing some of the archival work for the book, and it was after the dissertation so it was already kind of baked into the project, and it just looked like a great hook to me, and in so many ways opened up a kind of frustration that I have with the Arabic and Persian sources as a social, cultural, intellectual historian. So much of it is comes through the male elite, right? That we have writings largely by men, very little in the way of the voices of women, and then that's just part of how pre-industrial societies were organized broadly. It's not in any way an implication about Islamic writing, as though that's sui generis to Arabic or Persian. So, and actually, I had gotten into this project in a couple of different ways as a graduate student, around questions of translation broadly, questions of language. I had done a lot of work with Wolfhart Heinrichs on Giorgiani and the Dalal al-Ijaz, the Dalal al-Ijaz, his writings on the inimitability of the Quran. And I also was just running into this refrain that the Quran is untranslatable, and it seemed
Right.
like there's a lot more going on there. And then my
And
own
that's true. You hear that all the time. Sorry
yeah,
to jump in, Travis, but
yeah.
it's one of the first things you hear about the Quran. Oh, I've heard that you cannot translate the Quran. So yeah.
That's right. And actually one of my kind of first kind of ways of thinking about this was around my grandmother on my father's side, my paternal grandmother, who doesn't speak, she was Iranian, she's passed away, but she doesn't know Arabic, that didn't know English, and was very pious, and would read the Quran in Arabic, but didn't understand it really, and in a literal sense, as I came to learn as my Arabic improved, that there was a kind of space in between where she was accessing it, as it were. And so that problem was very interesting to me, of how to access the text in another language, as it were. And as you said, that there's this, you hear it all the time, that the Quran is untranslatable. It's actually part of Muslim reformist discourses as well, too, that you hear this in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. It becomes quite prominent, and there's an interesting history behind it. So there was just a confluence of questions. I gave a talk on the topic early as a graduate student, and Shahab Ahmed was there. the late Shahab Ahmed, who I think was in the Society of Fellows at Harvard at the time. And he had said this kind of dismissive comment, which also got to me, with, well, that topic has already been done. So there's not anything there to explore around this question of, is the Quran, how did Muslims encounter this problem? And I think what he meant by that, and in a certain sense, he was absolutely right. It had been done. There was a seminal piece by Abdul Latif Tibawi in 1962, I believe, of the Muslim World, Is the Quran Translatable? Early Muslim Opinion. Okay. And that piece would get cited several times in the scholarship, and he gives an overview largely from the juridical side of the problem. And I think if you just look at it at that angle, perhaps the question had been addressed, but it turns out there's a lot more going on there. And so that kind of dismissive comment that Shahab made, I don't think he put any weight in it, certainly. The comment, I think it just was just off the cuff, got to me. I felt like maybe there's more going on. Maybe it hasn't been done. Maybe there's more there. So that was
became actually a source of motivation, maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you mentioned in the introduction to the book that there are sort of two elements to the discourse around the idea that the Quran cannot be translated. And one side of it is polemical, and one side, or the other side, is maybe more apologetic. So on the polemical side, and I've heard this a lot, as an American, non-Muslim, speaking to American audiences, that Muslims are a diverse community. They're all over the world. Most of them are non-Arabic speakers. Not everyone knows that, actually. But those who know that would say, there are Muslims in Indonesia or South Africa or wherever, and they have to read the Quran in Arabic, and they read things they don't even understand. So there's this sort of, myth of like authoritarianism, that things are sort of shoved down their throat without their intellectual participation. So that's kind of the polemical side. What is your experience with that? Have you found that as well? And
that's right. I mean, as a scholar just starting into the field in the 90s and the 2000s, you'd run up against that all the time in the secondary scholarship, certainly, and just casually, these preconceptions that went really unexamined. And I think there is a kind of polemical undertone, like you said, of the authoritarianism. There's this idea about orthopraxy, that Islam is a religion of orthopraxy and not orthodoxy, and by that you get this sense of it's correct behavior, not correct belief, right. Which of course has a certain kind of Protestant critique baked into it, if we're talking from the sphere of Western secularism. And then if you trace that back into the Reformation around, discourses, say, of like sola scriptura and the importance of translation for the Reformation, and then certainly for the Enlightenment, and even, Renaissance humanism, just this European practice and development of translation is so vital to the intellectual history and the stories that we tell ourselves in the West about accessing the Bible directly, right? And how the printing press transformed all of these reading practices and sidestepped the clerical elite, as it were. And Muslims, the story goes, did not enjoy.
Never did it. They never got
never did it. Wow. Yeah, and there's the polemic built right into it, and it just became common wisdom, as it were, that just never really was questioned. Like even the early Orientalists would say, well, yes, they have these translations, they're not really translations, they're interlinear, and they didn't happen until much later. That was the idea. Yes. And then you get just to the point of Muslim reformists, you get, I come across this still today, that in India, people will say, well, Shah Wali Allah, the great Muslim reformist of Delhi in the 18th century, was the first to translate the Quran into Persian, which is absolutely wrong. But this is held out as an example of, almost like a Luther figure, right? Like somebody who's trying to do this important work of reformation, and then also a kind of prelude to modernity too. And of course, I track in the book and through the course of my own research, that the story is much more complicated.
The whole story is more complicated. There are all sorts of strategies, adaptations, innovations, which allowed non-Arabic speakers to understand the Quran, to engage with it.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's a great, I mean, to William Graham's credit, it's a wonderful book. His work on scripture and beyond the written word, and it's a comparative, ambitious book. And he repeats this refrain that it's only the Hanafis, which we'll get into, this juridical school, where translation is even like thought of, but otherwise it's kind of a closed door. And why I mention this is in talking about the strategies is it's also what I like about that book particularly is he forces us to think about scripture in non-Western context, where writing maybe isn't the most important element at all.
Right.
And that the recitation and the memorization of think about the Vedas, or in the context of the Zoroastrian scriptural practices, the Avesta, where you're accessing scripture not in a human language, as it were, or daily language, but in this other register of orality, and not in a written form at all, that is otherworldly. So there's certainly problems with the Reformation discourses around scripture as written, and primarily read internally, and not privileging a recited model. That makes it hard to understand these earlier practices of engaging the Quran in vernacular context.
Yes. And then on the other side of the coin, there is the what you mentioned as a more apologetic notion, motif that informs discourse about the untranslatability of the Quran. And I've heard this as well, in sometimes in different contexts. So in debates, for example, online and social media about something in the Quran, you'll hear an Arabic speaker say, well, how good is your Arabic?
Right.
Don't you know the Quran cannot really be, is not really Quran if it's not in Arabic.
Right.
So
right.
you can never understand it.
Right.
Yeah, so, and that presumably is tied into something you raised a little bit earlier, which is the question of the inimitability of the Quran, that it is perfect and inimitable in it. It's the Arabic Quran, which is inimitable.
Yeah, that very, very much so. And that's at the heart of, interestingly, very early discourses too, that we can get into early in a certain sense. I mean, how far back we want to go is what does early mean? You could say you find it in the Quran itself, right? Anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan. So that the Quran speaks of itself as an Arabic Quran.
We sent it down, or we delivered
it
as an Arabic Quran.
So that you may understand, so that it's revealed in an Arabic form in the Quran, and the Quran kind of accentuates itself as an Arabic revelation in important ways. And then there is this development later on, and that's why I say, what does early mean exactly? There's a later development of the inimitability, this ijaz that we're talking about. In later development, I mean the literary tradition, the written record of theologians writing in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, that we can access through this period of writing that takes place largely in Baghdad. Is not unique to Baghdad, but in this Iraqi Abbasid context, where much of our literary sources kind of survive for the early period. So, and in that sense, it is very much this later theological set of discourses that develop are very much apologetic. And I mentioned this Iraqi context because it's a site of sectarian diversity, that you have Christians, Muslims, Jews together, and they're reading each other's scriptures, and they're debating each other, and we know this in your own work has pointed to this, and it's a very rich period, and to read the discourses of inimitability and the untranslatability of the Quran in Arabic that develop in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, in this context helps understand how it's an apologetic defense of the Quran.
Yes. And then maybe these two trends actually in a way fuel each other, because you have modern English translations of the Quran, which don't name themselves translations, but are the meaning of the Holy Quran, or there are a number of these. I could look at my shelf if I sit up for a second and cite some examples of these. And so then, non-Muslim observers see these titles, and it kind of goes back and forth. But I mean, maybe there's a point there, after all, to the idea that the Quran cannot be ultimately translated, or maybe whether anything could be translated. Just a quotation here from the Vernacular Qur'an again. This book, on page 13, you write, in one sense, everything is translatable, though admittedly, in another sense, nothing is. So could you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, as you also noted in your generous introduction, I did my work in comparative literature at Harvard. So although I studied, most of my courses were in Near Eastern languages and civilization with the likes of Wolfhard and others, I had a good orientation in critical theory and literary theory as well. And so we'd been reading around translation theory broadly in my coursework, and also writings by the likes of Derrida on post-structuralism and others, and you have this at a high level. Translation is you can think of even Walter Benjamin in The Task of the Translator, where he talks about a very seminal piece in translation studies today, where he talks about the interlinear model as kind of ideal for translation, and he holds out Targumim in that sense. But he's also thinking about his own work with Baudelaire and poetry, and it's a kind of, you think of it as a push and pull, a spectrum. It's this idea that nothing is really translatable is certainly true in a sense, that there's always kind of signal and noise in the message of that you're communicating, that there's always something that it moves into the act of interpretation, that in translation inevitably involves interpretation as you move from the original language into the target language, right? As you go from the Arabic into the Persian, you're doing work that is inevitably interpretation and hermeneutical, and in that sense is losing the original text. And so there's real truth to that, not just about the Quran, but you could just broaden it out and just say that's just the fact of language. As we work in different closely with text in different languages, we're going to both gain something in that act of translation, we're going to lose something to that loss and gain. And so that metaphor, almost a mercantile metaphor, was very helpful for me. But of course, you could also, look at Google Translate today. What everything is translatable, everything is accessible, everything is immediate in a new way that wasn't really part of my thinking in the 90s and the early 2000s. But you could also make the counterclaim, of course, and that's certainly true, that translation happens, it works. It's just part of how we interact in different languages, in different contexts, and we're able to have access to the meaning behind things through this process of moving over, like translatio in Latin, the moving across. And it's fascinating. The word translatio is itself like a translation of the Greek metaphora, that it's the metaphor is even baked into the idea of translation, which is noteworthy as well. So that we are in a space of communication when we translate, and we lose things certainly, but it's certainly functional as well. I teach the Quran in translation all the time, and students have access to it, and they're able to get real information from it.
Yeah, great. Well, we're going to eventually hopefully get to some of the early translations of the Quran, which the translations did not begin with the translation of the Quran into Latin in the 12th century, but already Muslims were translating the Quran into Persian. So we're going to speak about that and some of the dimensions of those translations. How much were they exegetical? That is, how much were they commentaries? How much were they word for word? But I want to start maybe in exploring Islamic tradition on this question with some of the debates, which you can correct me on this. A lot of them were juridical. That is, they were debates or working through problems that had practical implications, for example, in ritual prayer. And we're going to speak with the Hanafis. I think we've already mentioned them briefly. We're going to speak with the Hanafis, who they were. But before, I read in your book a tradition about one of the companions of Muhammad. So the famous Persian, in his name is Persian Farisi, Salman al-Farisi. And there is a tradition that I think it was just the Fatiha, just the first chapter of the Quran, that he does he solicit the Prophet's permission, according to the tradition, to send this off to
Right.
folks in Iran, or
Right. That's right.
and yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. That, like you said, Salman al-Farisi, there's an early tradition around him requesting the Prophet to that he could translate the Fatiha. The tradition. I've written a piece on this in another context, just around this idea of Salman's Fatiha and the opening surah of the Quran. And how it plays in modern debates, because this topic of apologetic and polemic also continues in really interesting ways into modernity, and as does this story of the Fatiha that goes back to Salman, the first Persian convert, a kind of axiomatic figure in the early Islamic sacred history of conversion. As it unfolds, and that's right. It does play a role in some of the juridical discourses. You know, if you were to test this in a kind of the framework of, say, hadith criticism around trying to find how authentic is this account or not,
right.
Based upon the line of transmission, the isnad that would take it to the Prophet. It's not a very reliable tradition in that sense. We can't really trace it back with any kind of certainty, and that's actually something that gets highlighted in in modern debates around this question as well, that those that are kind of resisting the use of this anecdote, because it would give a prophetic sanction to the whole enterprise. And if you were to, you can actually trace the account quite early, relatively speaking, you know, from our vantage point, but certainly not back to the Prophet's time. But it does circulate around in Hanafi circles, this juridical school that we'll talk about, and is very important in their own justification for a position that goes back to Abu Hanifa, the founder of Hanafi law or fiqh, but he doesn't seem to know this story, and the story is really. As far as I've been able to tell, if I'm just using an isnad analysis, this is analysis of the transmission of the account, you can get it into the 800s probably.
But you could see how important it would be for someone who wanted to make the case for translating the Quran, and presumably using that translation in ritual prayer, which the
absolutely
is used for.
That's right. And interestingly, we have a record of it as well. It exists, a literary record of what it was, and it is in a very archaic form of Persian. But that's exactly right, that it's used as a proof text, and but maybe it is also documenting a set of practices as well, which is interesting too. That it's both probative, that this has a prophetic sunnah, a prophetic model built into it and sanction, according to the Hanafi jurists that draw upon it, and it also is so interesting as a documentary point of view, is that it is one of these early examples of New Persian that we have as well. Because so part of the cool story of the Vernacular Qur'an is it's also the story of Persian emerging as a literary language in a written form, which doesn't happen in other Muslim vernaculars until later, really.
Because just to very briefly trace that further back, we do have texts in, I might get something wrong here, but maybe Middle Persian, what the Sasanians were using.
Exactly.
But then there's sort of a gap, and then Persian reappears now in the Arabic script. Is that
that's right?
With Quran translations, or?
That's perfect. Not just the Quran translations, but also other literary materials as well. And it actually the Quranic material appears simultaneously with the rise of early, what we call early New Persian, and it's precisely as you said, written in the Arabic script, as opposed to the Pahlavi script that was used, like you noted, for these Sasanian elites. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay, so we've mentioned the term Hanafi a few times now, and obviously the viewers will get a signal that they're important to this whole tradition, or these classical debates on the translation of the Quran. Hanafis are one of four Sunni legal schools, at least the four that make it, that survive to the contemporary period. You already mentioned Abu Hanifa, who dies in 767 CE, 150 Hijri. Who is either the founder or at least traditionally the founder of the Hanafi school. I don't know if we want to get into that debate. So yeah, in very broad terms, what's distinctive about the Hanafis? Why do people mention the Hanafis when it comes to the translation of the Quran?
That's right. So to answer that first question, it's that they will highlight in this very narrow framework, and that's around ritual prayer that we alluded to, that it is permissible for those who do not know Arabic to recite the Quran in translation, and that seems to be a kind of unique position with respect to the other schools that you discussed. That there's four the surviving schools of.
Is that still? I'm sure you said it in the book and I missed it, but is that agreed upon by Hanafi scholars today, or do some scholars say no, that actually is not the Hanafi position?
Yeah,
So we
so
have classical texts which clearly attribute this position in different ways to the founders of Hanafism. But is there a debate among Hanafis today?
So there's modulation, and it's
Okay.
it's alive. It's an alive kind of topic, and
Okay.
in the sense in Egypt when in the early 20th century when there was debates over publishing English translations of the Quran, there's a very lively debate about this. That also is set in the context of colonialism and anti-imperialism, and this polemic apologetic push and pull that we've been discussing. The Hanafi kind of early Hanafi position is drawn upon as a justification for translations, not just in the space of ritual prayer, which is very narrow, notably, but also in this much broader sense of publishing full translations of the Quran in a written form, so away from just ritual prayer. Likewise, in Turkey, there's a whole modern Turkey, both Egypt and Turkey, of course, being important sites for Hanafi law. These early sources were very, very much at play in the 19th and 20th century discussion. So needless to say, there's also modulation across the development of Hanafi law on this particular issue, where you get a more over time kind of push and pull and even resistance to these earlier positions. And I should note that the positions go from like Abu Hanifa, the founder of the school, or right. To his disciples, and that his position is even more radical than that of his disciples. So
yeah, could you clarify that?
Yeah. So there's these two Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani are his two main disciples, and they are again in this Iraqi context of Baghdad. Writing. Abu Yusuf is the head judge for the Abbasids in Baghdad, the first to take the name judge of all judges, as it were. Itself a kind of Sasanian, has an echo of a Sasanian titulature in it. But both of them modulate according to the Hanafi tradition, and these are texts are authoritative in Hanafi law. So these three figures, Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad al-Shaybani, are kind of crucial figures in the development of Hanafi law and are drawn upon as authoritative voices in their own right for their rulings. And the two disciples say that kind of circumscribe Abu Hanifa's position, and they say that it's only those that don't know Arabic who can do this. And that's not just the prayer, ritual prayer, salat, but also the call to prayer and other forms of ritual activity that might involve the use of the Quran in Arabic. So they limit it to non-Arabic speakers. And then if you actually think about it, and this is something that the Hanafi discourse will develop over time, that it doesn't take much of the Quran to fulfill these ritual requirements.
Right.
It's a very small amount of the Quran that needs to be memorized. And so it's almost like the problem becomes otiose over time. Like as you become a convert into, as you become a Muslim into the Muslim community, you will learn a sufficient amount of Arabic, that it won't be a problem whatsoever. So by circumscribing it, by limiting this almost unconditional use of translation, is what Abu Hanifa appears to be advocating for anyone, by putting a condition on it, as it were.
So that, although they're thinking in a juridical context, there are interesting theological possible implications for the contrast between Abu Hanifa and Shaybani and Abu Yusuf on the other side, because one could say that the Shaybani Abu Yusuf position is just a temporary practical concession.
That's right.
So all religions do this, you just
Yeah.
need to work something out because in this case you have someone who cannot speak enough Arabic, but they
Right.
have
Exactly.
Iman, they have faith as a Muslim now. But it sounds like Abu Hanifa who says, no, if unconditionally it's acceptable to you.
Yes.
There must be more profound theological implications to that, namely that it's still Quran when you're reciting or when you're professing or proclaiming it in Persian or another language.
Yeah, and actually, to this issue of the authenticity of these texts, which is fascinating as well, because it gets to the problem of how do we historicize this too. In many ways, this position is very archaic if we think about it, because the Abu Hanifa's position
Okay. Okay.
is that it represents something that is now no longer normative
Yes.
in the
Yes.
legal tradition. If we think about it just legally
So that means today, if someone converts to Islam in I don't know, Pakistan, Indonesia, or somewhere, there are other, maybe Pakistan's better because they're more Hanafis. Uh, they would just get a quick crash course
yeah,
in reciting enough Quran in
yeah,
Arabic to do
that's right.
your prayer and.
Yeah. And there's something kind of radical about Abu Hanifa's position, and also forces us to think differently about the Quran in this very early period of the 700s. Because as you said, he dies in the middle of the 8th century. And also to think about what conversion was looking like in that period as well, which is actually at the heart of what animated my own interest historically in the book, was what did it mean for conversion to happen in mass in certain areas and in certain contexts where whole towns or communities might convert, but also following the work of Richard Bullitt, where also conversion seems to happen kind of gradually and over time in his seminal work on conversion in Islam. And so Abu Hanifa's position suggests very much so this idea of meaning behind the text, and it also suggests a kind of open Quran. And if we think about what's going on simultaneously in this, if we're in the 8th century, for the history of the Quran, it's a period of variant readings, that you get a whole proliferation of variant readings that will only become really systematized and then ultimately canonized in the subsequent centuries, so that they become stabilized and fixed and then closed, so that there's only
it's a really
set,
important point.
parameters of what could make it in there. And there are,
which just to clarify the importance of that point, if we're seeing eye to eye, or I'm on your wavelength here. I mean, that suggests that in mosques or at homes where people are doing ritual prayer, from house to house or mosque to mosque, there could be minor variations, because there's systems of 7 or 10 variant readings, all of which are considered valid in Quran. So there's as you mentioned, there's a kind of openness there.
Yeah, and it's an openness that you could think is born out of just the reality of textual transmission before the age of mechanical reproduction, right? That we're dealing with oral transmissions, and indeed a privileging of oral transmissions. If you go into the early fiqh works, the works on hadith and fiqh, from this period of the 8th century, you get a picture of transmission of the Quran that is very, very much about learning from somebody who has memorized the Quran, that you don't learn from someone who has book knowledge, but that it's transmitted from heart to heart, from student to teacher to student and onwards, verbally and orally. And just in the course of oral transmission, you can see why there would be natural variants that could emerge, apart from the larger kind of theological questions, just at the social linguistical model of transmission. And with that proliferation of variants, you get, and then the acceptance of them in fiqh works, and then ultimately in the field of Quranic studies, as you note, the canonization of these the 7 canonical traditions of variant readings, and then there's more after that. There's wonderful work by Christopher Melchert and others on this topic. But what you get is a model, and you see this in the Hanafi writings, but also beyond just Hanafi writings, as well, of privileging the meaning over in Arabic it's lafz and mana, so the form, the linguistic form versus the meaning of the mana of the Quran. So you'll have sayings where going back to Abu Hanifa and others, and actually tracing it back to Ibn Mas'ud, an early Quran reciter, early companion, who's an important figure in Kufa, dies in the end of the 7th century, a very important figure in the history of Quranic recitation, where he will say, and this is a Hanafi position that goes back to Ibn Mas'ud, that the issue is not saying, confusing Rahman with Rahim, you gives that model, but rather, taking a verse of compassion and substituting it for a verse of punishment. So you can mix and match, as it were, is the idea that Ibn Mas'ud is saying, as long as you're not missing the message. And that's a different model of understanding the Quran than the model that develops around the inimitability and untranslatability discourses in theology, where it suggests that lafz and mana, form and meaning, are inseparable, and thus translation is entirely impossible because the meaning is the form and vice versa. So it's a very open model and vision of the Quranic text in Arabic. We're not even talking about translation here. Yes. We're just talking about Arabic substitutions, like of synonyms, or getting the gist of it. And indeed, there's wonderful work by Gregor Scholler on this, about the recitation of Arabic poetry and even hadith, that there's this idea of riwaya bil mana, the transmission by meaning versus the transmission by form, and that this was very common for hadith and for poetry. Kind of prior to it, that if you're getting the gist of it, getting the sense of it, as a model for oral transmission. But that ultimately is not a model for the Quranic transmission in time, that it closes and it's fixed and finalized, as it were. And actually, it gets to the point of the vocalization of the Quran too, in the written form. The history of the Quran as a text is a written text, and the way in which it's vocalized and pointed the consonantal and vocalic structure of the text in its written orthographic form evolves over time calligraphically, and that also becomes more fixed in the sense that the ambiguities of the early, say, Hijaz, they're called Hijazi masahif or codices that we have there, they are ambiguous with respect to the correct pronunciation.
Yes, that's a very important element that's tough to communicate on a podcast.
I'm so sorry.
But you need a PowerPoint, right, to sort of show the rasam or the consonantal script.
Yes, exactly. And it requires, they're really memory aids. They have to be. They require the memorization of the Quran to read these early documents, our earliest Quranic documents. And they presuppose a community who has memorized the text. And they also suggest a different idea of what the text is and its function is, as a written document, I should say, the written text. So this is what I meant by Abu Hanifa's position. Actually gives us an interesting insight into early attitudes about the Quran that become archaic, that are abandoned over time, because his position, is just a next step. If you can do transmission by meaning, if you can get the meaning of the Quran in Arabic, well, then why can't you do that in other languages?
Right. But just to be clear about the sort of the historical element of this question, I mean, as I understand it from your book, The Vernacular Qur'an, if the position of Abu Hanifa becomes archaic, I mean, at least in the early period, it was not, what's the right word, purely theoretical. That is, you mentioned, at least I remember one account in the book where you speak about the conquest of the city of Bukhara, where we have anecdotes according to which people were performing basic elements of the ritual prayer using non-Arabic languages.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And that's what's so exciting about this material, is how do we get to the social history of what it was like for early communities of converts, of Arabs interacting with non-Arabs. What were these kind of frictions like, and tensions around scripture and the use of scripture and its presence or absence in the process of conversion. And these anecdotes absolutely give us some insight into. I think you can triangulate them in interesting ways and get some more information and ideas about what was going on. It's very hard to tell the reality on the ground. Like why does Abu Hanifa have this position at all? Is he following a practice, or is he establishing practice? And for me, these very important writings by Wilfred Madelung and Joseph Van Es on a group of theologians known as the Morjia, which we can talk about, have been very helpful for me when I was thinking about this problem, because the Morjia in the Hanafis, the early Hanafis have associations with them. They're a group that don't kind of survive on today and are largely considered in modern orthodoxy as heretical, but they were very prominent in the 7 and 8.
Yeah, Morjia is one of those titles, a little bit like Mu'tazili, but maybe worse, that no one really wants to assume today, even if they may actually hold those positions. I mean, I don't know if you agree, but that's my sense of it.
Oh yeah. It is. They are kind of beyond the pale today, like one of these titles of and disappear largely. But at least the point here being is that one of these positions, and it's very much at the heart of early Hanafi writings, and those are associated with Abu Hanifa, is that of faith over acts, a kind of privileging in the context of conversion. That if you get what we need to focus on here for the Morjia, they're arguing, is one's inner belief and not whether they know where Mecca is, or know the correct direction of prayer, or know who Muhammad is even. There's these ideas that are at the heart of these early debates. And ultimately they become so kind of estranged, as it were, these ideas to what is normative, that they're all but abandoned. But you can find, and certainly Madelung and Van Es have done brilliant work on uncovering these forgotten chapters of the 8th century, where these ideas were very, very much at the fore, and they're at the heart of questions of conversion, really. If you think about it, like, what does it mean for people that don't know any Arabic whatsoever to be a believer? Right, and what is the sociological status, the status of an individual,
very interesting,
person, if they don't have any access to Arabic? And so they're wrestling with these problems, and I think you, as you said, you can put these anecdotes of actual use of translation for prayer. You can put like Salman al-Farisi's translation of the Fatiha that we have in Persian, in the Arabic script. You can put these ideas around faith and acts, these tensions, all into concert to try to get an insight into what was going on. And it's a much more complex than just saying, translation was entirely forbidden. And this is at the level of ritual prayer, which is actually very, very limited too, right? Like we're not even talking about writing yet. We're just talking oral performance.
Exactly. I hope it's not too much of a tangent, because I do want to circle back to the Hanafis at least at one point before we get to some other intellectual currents of thought in medieval Islam. But the way you describe the social history really paints a vivid picture of a society and religious figures therein who are, maybe scrambling is not fair, but trying to sort out, there's this great, piety, religious zeal, eagerness for dawah, that is, to convert others to Islam or invite others to Islam. But then you have to manage when people come into Islam. How do you do this? So you just got to work things out. And sometimes the zeal for conversion it seems to me, exerts a certain pressure on doctrine. And I see this in the contemporary period a little bit. I don't know if you want to comment about that. We're sort of jumping ahead 1,000 years or so. But I mean, you mentioned the early 20th century around debates around translation, publishing translations of the Quran in Egypt and elsewhere. Obviously, translations are everywhere today. There's a million websites and apps with translations. They're eagerly used. A lot of this, it seems to me, is at the service of what Muslims call dawah.
Yeah, that's
which
right. Yeah,
could be either reforming Muslims to become more Muslim or inviting others to convert to Islam.
that's right.
I mean, I see it, yeah, but also, loudspeakers, the Friday communal prayer that is used for the sermon, obviously for the call to prayer as well. There was hesitancy around loudspeakers. Yeah, it seems interesting how these social realities can have doctrinal implications.
Oh, very much so. And both, of course, in the modern period that we are dealing with a radically different context in certain ways, but the parameters have interesting resonance with these earlier patterns and earlier chapters of Islamic history. And it is, of course, if we go back to the 700s and 800s, a period of radical transformation, just like in the modern era as well, that this move from a world where the Western Hemisphere wasn't known to globalization, and then ultimately the development of mass print culture, and then into the internet age and beyond today of interconnectedness and the, like you mentioned, the mobile apps and the internet and the wide proliferation and development of translations, that you would not get the sense whatsoever that that translation is resisted in that regard.
Right.
And precisely, you see very, very much so in these translations, pious work of, like you said, often framed as the meaning of the Quran and not the Quran itself, but theological and juridical ideas that make their way hermeneutically or exegetically into these translations
Yes.
as
Yes.
well. And that it too has in these modern translations, that too has just so many parallels with the pre-modern period and
Yes.
the early development.
There are some websites out there with English translations of the Quran that categorize them according to Muslim translations, non-Muslim, and then you'll see something like a non-Orthodox, unorthodox Muslim translations as well. So that, I mean, that reflects some of that concern for the process of translation as articulating
Right.
the canonical or orthodox meaning of the text. If it's okay, I'd like to circle back to the Hanafis.
Yeah, absolutely.
One more question in on the Hanafis. I took us far afield, but I did want to just circle back to this question of mana and lafz, which you mentioned. So mana being the meaning of the Quran or any text, and then lafz being the articulation of the text. And you mentioned that there's a certain privileging, at least relative privileging of mana among Hanafis. And I want to ask then about what Hanafis would do with the Quran's allusions to earlier scriptures, because according to the sacred history of the Quran, the revelation to Muhammad is not the first scripture sent down by God to a prophet. There were at least, actually there are more, but we'll just focus on the big ones. A scripture, the Torah, sent down to Moses, and a scripture, the Injil, sent down to Jesus. So these are equally, completely also the book of God, according to standard Islamic teaching. And I think you could correct me on this, most Muslim authorities would say these were revealed not in Arabic, but in other languages, probably Hebrew. Probably in both cases, most Muslim scholars would say Hebrew. And we could speak about that as well. But to ask a more pointed question, were there Hanafis who countenanced the possibility of performing ritual prayer, including recitation from the Bible, from the revelation of Moses and Jesus?
Yes. So we again, the sources here are important. That we have the material of Abu Hanifa is recorded through his disciples largely. So it's this process of written transmission that is what passes on these positions over time. And there's an element of kind of dialogue and debate that goes on in these transmissions. So we have, if I recall correctly, it's through Shaybani that we get Abu Hanifa's position on the use of the Bible, and I believe it's the Torah, and it might be also the Injil. I'd have to double check, but where he acknowledge, it's in this kind of question and response form of student asking teacher, and that even the Bible could be used for translation, for the use of prayer, precisely to this point. This will get debated over time, ultimately, and then again, one of these anachronistic kind of positions that will be abandoned.
Yes, yes.
And
It
it's
must seem completely ludicrous today in an Islamic
entirely
context.
ludicrous, and today from a pious Orthodox position, precisely because, indeed, it's in the heart of the Quranic understanding of other earlier scriptures of this idea of falsification or tahrif, that these scriptures were distorted in their transmission. It's an idea, interestingly, that has roots in Manichaean thought. It's an idea that goes back to Christian Jewish polemic as well.
The idea of falsification.
The falsification of other scriptures, and the Quran picks it up. So it's in the milieu of late antiquity, certainly, of these earlier revelatory texts. In this case, for the Quran, thinking about the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels, seeing them as distorted in some form, and thus questionable in terms of their juridical or ritual use. And so Abu Hanifa's position is very, very, or the kind of account of this position is very radical, but it circulates in Hanafi scholarship, so there's a kind of recognition of it. And again, we're dealing here in this realm of ritual prayer, and so it's and for converts too, that those that don't have access really to it, that's a suggestion.
Yes.
But it does suggest, it also points to this idea of a kind of intelligibility, and if we go into the kind of social milieu, Abu Hanifa of course comes from a Persian background, ancestry. That's the general understanding within the tradition itself around the pious biographies of Abu Hanifa that develop within the school. And if we're thinking about Iraq, in this period, and I'm mentioning Iraq because it's so important for the development of Arabic literary culture with the Abbasids. We're dealing with non-Arabs, kind of sociologically, or in a very insignificant way, and so that has interesting things to say about the early Umayyads. And if we get into the 7th century discourses about Arabs and non-Arabs,
yes.
Peter Webb has a wonderful book on this very problem, and that the very kind of important role that the clients or Mawali play in the development of non-Arab clients to Arab tribes is a complicated set of social relations that unfold under the Umayyads and into the Abbasids. And it suggests a kind of a real complexity, because so many of the authorities for the transmission of the Quran itself, if we get into even just the oral transmission of the what are called the recitations, the qira'at, overwhelmingly we're dealing with non-Arabs memorizing the Quran and transmitting it in an authoritative way, and thus being absorbed within this community of Muslims, where Arabic becomes this language of hegemonic authority. And at the same time, we're dealing with non-Arabs who are coming, maybe first generation, second generation converts, who have access to other scriptural practices as well. And
so the social context, yes.
And I think that's perhaps behind this idea that is it with Abu Hanifa, we're dealing with maybe Arabs, non-Arabs that are coming from Jewish or Christian or maybe even Zoroastrian backgrounds, maybe less so, and that had their own set of liturgical practices, and what to do with those, and ultimately those are abandoned clearly.
Yes. So what becomes, in fact, the standard approach to the question of ritual prayer in non-Arabic languages is, of course, that and that's represented by the other Sunni jurisprudential traditions. You mentioned the Shafis and the Malikis and others who insist that the Quran is Arabic, therefore naturally, and you've quoted for us from the Quran, which describes itself as an Arabic Quran. So therefore ritual prayer must be in Arabic. But the actual sort of standard doctrine in the world of theology is much more complicated.
Yes.
And we have a couple more minutes to explore that at least a bit. because as you note in the book, the Vernacular Qur'an, there's the movement, it's probably not the right term, maybe policy in the mid or early mid 9th century in Baghdad by a series of caliphs, starting with Ma'mun and then Mu'tasim and Wathiq, all of whom sort of enforce a theological doctrine that the Quran is created. And that sort of follows for them, or at least for the theological school associated with this teaching, the Mu'tazila, follows from the idea that, well, if the Quran is Arabic, then I don't know if it follows from, or this is just sort of an associated argument, but if the Quran is Arabic, any human language, including Arabic, is necessarily created.
Right.
So maybe you could just, fill out that picture a little bit and explain what the reaction is of the opponents. Ultimately, the Ash'aris, there's some others involved, but the Ash'aris who established standard doctrine on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And there's you can see how, in addition to this juridical discourse that we've been discussing, that centers largely on ritual prayer and ritual activity, there's all these theological implications as well. Right. And that early Hanafis not only upheld certain kinds of ideas around faith and acts that are get kind of reformulated over time. There are several that are connected to Mu'tazili thought too. And you could imagine a world, and indeed I try to trace this in the book, where discourses about the created Quran, the Quran being, and as you highlighted, that the Abbasids, the several Abbasid caliphs kind of instituted this as a doctrine, would be amenable to translation in that sense that, well, if the Quran is created in an Arabic form, it is temporal and in a human language, and thus accessible to humans. And so, and indeed, this is precisely this space where we get the rise of very sophisticated linguistic and theological writings around the inimitability of the Quran in the 9th century. And
in what that could consist of, because
right.
Is it inimitable in its articulation, in its meaning? Today, people would say maybe in its scientific knowledge. I mean, there are all sorts of dimensions that could be engaged here.
That's right, and that there were a variety of responses, but one of the important kind of element to this, like, what is it, linguistic, as you said, or in other forms, what does its miraculous nature entail? And one of the implications theologically in this response that is developed by Ash'ari theologians, picking up on earlier theologians again in Iraq, in the the 8th and 9th centuries, is that the Quran is eternal. This is the kind of response to the created Quran, that no, it's not created, but eternal. And then in what way is it eternal? And then they have to answer the question, in what way is it human language? How can it be eternal, something that doesn't change, is everlasting, and in the form of human speech? And the Ash'aris develop a very sophisticated idea, building on others, of this kind of kalam nafsi, or inner speech, as well, and also the notion that there's some kind of linguistic mediation that's taking place.
Very interesting.
As it goes from.
So the Quran, from the Ash'ari perspective, is described as kalam nafsi, meaning God's inner speech, which is not the same as an articulated human language. It's something special to God.
Yeah, that is incorruptible, unchanging, and you could think of it as a kind of ontic oneness, that it's something that can't really take the form of human speech, because human speech is temporal in every way. That you could, right? That it happens in time. It changes, and it's dynamic, and it involves sound and voicing, and writing as well, which is corruptible. And so this idea of this kind of divine language as existing in another plane. Well, then how does it get into Arabic? And it's Jibril or Gabriel who comes to form this role as a divine translator, and articulating it in this eternal speech, this attribute really of God, and articulating it into the language of humans, and that's something that's developed in very prominently in Ash'ari thought. This notion of it being a kind of ibara, or an expression of God's eternal speech, or a hekaya, a mimetic representation. And you're already in that space of translation, right? As soon as you move into those words. And so that's in the background as well. A very interesting.
Sorry to jump in, but a very different sort of translation, not
Right.
horizontal, but vertical maybe too.
Yeah, from like the divine realm to the human realm, and actually at the heart of this discourse of tanzil, of revelation coming down from the celestial to the terrestrial, and you can see that as a kind of not that an invitation for translation as such, and from Arabic into Persian, what's going to unfold, but ultimately a way of thinking about our interaction with language and the divine, and recognizing the limits too. So to uphold the eternal status of the Quran, while also conceding that language is, in the Arabic language itself, as having a kind of a human element in it, and simultaneously there's all these interesting discourses about what's the language of heaven, and what's the relationship between Arabic and Hebrew and Syriac, as well as divine languages. So these are in the mix, and they're happening in this context of Christians, Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, a real sectarian mix, as it were, talking about scripture. Yeah.
So just maybe this is simplistic, but to sort of articulate how an Ash'ari classically would see the process of God's speech, there's this kalam nafsi, this quality of God, eternal, unchanging quality of God, which is communicated or expressed, you mentioned this term ibada, via, there's a lot we're not actually addressing because it's very difficult to think through these things, but the angel Gabriel,
right,
who, for Moses, for example, to use the example of the Torah, for
right,
Moses, articulated that kalam nafsi into Hebrew, but for Muhammad, articulated it into Arabic.
That's right.
Yeah, so that sounds okay.
Yeah, and then ultimately that Arabic will have a special sociological status because Muhammad is the seal of prophecy. There's going to be old discourses about Arabic as the language of angels and of heaven. Yeah,
very interesting.
But there's also
but isn't there some competition? Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a tradition of Ibn Abbas about God only sends down a scripture in Hebrew, and then Gabriel translates it. So isn't there a little, at least in the early period, probably because I know you also mentioned Shafi'i is a big, this other founder of a juridical school is a big fan of Arabic. But I mean, there's some competition between Hebrew and Arabic as sort of the heavenly language. And
that's right. Very much so. And that, and of course, this builds upon Jewish Christian discourses, and that preceded and are overlap with what's happening in the Middle East, and so there is this very famous Ibn Abbas statement, and others also about Suryaniya of kind of Syriac or maybe Aramaic as this ancient language, the Adamic language too, and it's a part of larger. You could say push and pull or argumentation around the nature of language as having a divine origin. It has interesting linguistic questions behind it too, and because we have such a rich tradition in Arabic of philology, it's picked up in early writings of philologists as well about, is language pre-established, its meaning and form pre-established in a defined sense, or does it evolve over time and change? And there's a lot of contestation around these issues. It also has interesting implications for going back to the question of the untranslatability of the Quran, implications for the kind of theophoric or divine kind of nature of speech in the Quran, and theophoric names of God as well. And Derrida, going back to kind of modern theoretical discourse on translation, has this fascinating comment that its proper names are untranslatable. And if we think with this more around the Quran as in what way is it untranslatable? If it is itself a kind of divine speech, it almost asks and demands itself, if you hold that position, to be not only untranslatable but also beyond the human as well. That it is what it is, and that it can't really be digested in a human form, and that we can only approach it or access it. I mean, approaching it, thinking of Michael Sell's use in the title of his book, Approaching the Quran, that you can get near it, but you can't really have it in its fullness, and that its fullness is it doesn't need any explanation. It just contains itself. And there's a very long tradition of that notion of language. So that's why I bring this up in the late antique milieu, in which the Quran emerges, in the use of divine angelic names or divine names of God. And the Quran seems to even be alluding to this in interesting.
You mean use of names in a magical context, or maybe that's not the right term?
Oh, no, I don't think that's too strong. I mean, magic is of course, not maybe the word that would be used, but
right, yeah.
For the actors
connotations, yes,
that we're talking about, but right, that you could think of it as theurgy or for various protective or
against the evil eye, or
evil eye, even what ritual prayer, like the idea that you're in a space of communion or interaction, and that it's sui generis, that it takes its very form. And it's in a divine kind of context, and that it can't kind of be mapped out into another form. Magic seems strong, right? But it has this sense of divine speech, and there is a very long tradition in that Muslims certainly absorb and become part of interacting with language in this way, and specifically the Quran in this way, that it's efficacious precisely in it, like the ipsissima verba Dei, in its very form of God. It's the very
very words of God,
in that way, and that to translate it is to miss it, and is to lose that efficacious power that is a surplus that's beyond its actual linguistic meaning, and that it's doing something much, much more. And even the last two surahs of the Quran, the Mu'adhatain, as these surahs of seeking refuge in the Quran, they are used very early on in ways that you would think of as apotropaic, of defending against the evil eye, or protecting, or and they're doing things with words, right? Like they're doing more than just what they communicate. They have another element of efficacious power to them.
Well, I think that points us in a really intriguing and fruitful new direction. I hope that we can explore that more, but it might be in a second episode, because there's a lot I'd like to speak about that regarding that in the context of how Muslim tradition understands Arabic, but then also the names of God in particular. I know you've done some work on that. By the way, before I ask you to say a little bit about your current work, I just want to apologize, because the second half of this book is all about the tradition of Persian translation of the Quran. We didn't get there at all. I think I said at the beginning of our chat we would get there, and we didn't. So maybe we can bring that up also in a second episode. This book, viewers will not think that this is just a platitude after hearing this discussion, but this is one of the most informative and eloquently written books in Islamic studies. So I'd really encourage people to dive deeply into the Vernacular Qur'an by Travis Zadeh. But before we go, can you mention just a little bit of your current work, since we've been speaking about your earlier book? What have you been working on, and what will you be working on?
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you very much for the kind words, and again, this invitation to be in dialogue. I have just finished this book on cosmology in Islamic thought, and it stems out of these broader questions of translation, and that have been a through line through much of my research, and the kind of opening gambit for me has been, how do we understand the past in its own terms? Like, as historians, that's something that is very much animates our work, is trying to get at an understanding of the world in terms that are legible to the people of the period that we're looking at, and thinking with issues around social history and culture. But it's very hard when we are in a modern framework to do that. And it's very hard in a very basic cosmological sense, because we know the world to be divided into two hemispheres, with a Western and Eastern hemisphere. We know of the Americas. We're in the Americas today, which pre-moderns didn't really have access to, in at least thinking about from the other side of the globe. And likewise, we know the world to be, well, if not geocentric, right? To be much more complex in its cosmic form, and so that the development of heliocentrism, certainly, and then modern cosmology as well. So we have a very different just orientation to our own place in the world than pre-moderns and in this pre-industrial framework did. And so the book, this latest book, has been an attempt to try to understand the world prior to these ruptures, and try to do that in terms that are, at least, if not entirely in their own form, but more legible than just a kind of dismissal of these cosmic ways of thinking. And they're very much at the heart of the Quran too. And the Quran has built into it a sense of contemplating nature and of contemplating the world around us as a way of understanding God. And that was at the heart of theological thinking, certainly for Muslims, and also thinking about creation and the natural world. And so the project of the heart of the book is kind of tracking these ideas and how they ebb and flow over time, and doing it through a variety of different sources that might not be put into dialogue with each other, not only Quranic interpretation, but natural history and philosophy, as well as actually books on practical magic as too. And so it's a kind of broad survey, as it were.
Beautiful. I would love to, not just like, but love to have you back to speak about this second book. Again, the title of that book is Wonders and Rarities, the Marvelous Book That Traveled the World and Mapped the Cosmos, published in 2023. Professor Zadeh, thank you so much for being with me. It was a real gift to exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.